For most Westerners, the term little people, when used in the context of folklore, might conjure up images of the leprechauns of Irish fable, the dwarves of Germanic legend, or the fairies of Celtic tradition. It might surprise some Canadians to learn that a wealth of forgotten tales, eerily similar to these European legends, can be found in nearly every corner of the Great White North, in both First Nations and settler tradition. The area with the highest concentration of such stories seems to be the province of Ontario, home of the Great Lakes, the Canadian Shield, and the southern shores of Hudson's Bay. In previous pieces, we explored the Kashubian dwarf lore of the Madawaska Highlands, east of Algonquin Provincial Park, Cornish-Canadian pixie legends from Ontario's Oxford and Waterloo counties, historical Ojibwa tales of Memegwaysuck, or cliff-dwelling water dwarfs, set in Ontario's Lake Nipissing, Lake Temiskaming, and Oiseau Rock, and first-hand encounters with little people in Toronto's Scarborough District, Rouge National Urban Park, and the towns of Bancroft and Port Parry. In this piece, we will dig up more traditional native little people legends from Canada's Heartland province. In his 1965 book, Legends of My People, The Great Ojibwa, celebrated Canadian Anishinaabe artist Norval Morrisseau included a strange story told to him by Ojibwa elders from Ontario's Lake Nipigon. This story describes a race of little people who once lived in the frozen forests and muskeg surrounding Fort Albany, a historic Hudson's Bay Company trading post built where the Albany River meets James Bay. The artist made a distinction between the diminutive subjects of this tale and the aforementioned cliff-dwelling Memegwaysuck, as he called them, regarding the latter as mermen. There was a tribe of Indians called Ojijikoonsuk, Morrisseau wrote, who were very troublesome, although they never hurt or killed anyone, but they had a habit of stealing whatever they got their hands on. Sometimes they would try to steal young women for wives. At times they succeeded. These Indians were short and heavy, about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. In their tribe, they had a chief who was a troublemaker. This chief advised all his men to go among the Ojibwa and steal and make trouble. The Ojibwa finally laid down the law and made them stop these troublesome habits and showed them that the Ojibwa word was to be obeyed, or they would kill all their tribe, sparing no one. From that day, no Ojijikoons ever bothered the Ojibwa again, for the Ojibwa were their masters, and the law of the Ojibwa had to be respected. Absent of any references to otherworldly powers or inhuman qualities, this story seems to indicate that the Ojijikoonsuk were pygmies, unusually short but otherwise prosaic human beings, and not the mysterious preternatural entities which populate the bulk of native dwarf legends. The distinction between these two different creatures is not always so clearly delineated. In their 1962 book, Ojibwa Myths and Legends, folklorist Sister Bernard Coleman, Ellen Frogner, and Estelle Ike used the word pygmy to denote the little people of the water, thickets, woods, and cliffs. In other words, the Memegwaysuck, whom Morrisseau regarded as mermen. Usually, wrote the folklorists, we heard that the home of these tiny people was under the hills. One informant said that the little people were especially mischievous on stormy nights. They caused no end of trouble. They themselves could never be seen, but the next morning, their footprints in the sand along the lakeshore gave evidence that they had been there. A more thorough description of the legendary Little People of Ontario appears in American anthropologist Frank Goldsmith Speck's 1915 treatise on the myths and folklore of the Algonquin of Lake Temiskaming and the Ojibwa of Lake Temagami. According to Speck, the Ojibwa of Lake Temagami regarded the Memegwesi, as he called them, as a species of creature which lives in the high, remote ledges. They are small and have hair growing all over their bodies. The Indians think they are like monkeys, judging from specimens of the latter which they have seen in the picture books. These dwarf-like creatures have ugly faces and seek to hide them when they meet with people. A little narrative of a meeting with these creatures is told by some Temagami Indians who had been to Lake Temiskaming. The Indians were passing a high ledge of rock a few miles below Haileybury, where the water was very deep and where they had set their nets. They found that somebody had been stealing fish. They proceeded to watch the nets and soon saw 3 Memegwesi come out, astride of an old log for a canoe, using sticks for paddles. The Indians pursued them, the fairies meanwhile hiding their faces. Finally, the Indians caught one. Then one Indian said, "Look behind." When the fairy turned quickly, they caught a glimpse of how ugly he was. The Indians then took a knife from this fairy, and the rest disappeared, riding their log through the rock wall to the inside, where they could be heard crying, as this is where they lived. The Indians then threw the knife at the rock, and it went right through to the inside to its owner. A nearly identical story appears in folklorist Wayne M. Cucci's 2000 book, Some Legends and Myths of the Nipissing Tribal Indians, set in the rocky, forested wilderness south of present-day Sudbury, Ontario. This tale was related by Ernest Cucci, a Nipissing Ojibwa elder who died in 1986 at the age of 99. Many years ago, Cucci said, a band of Ojibways who lived in the French River area just south of Nipissing made their living from net fishing. In one particular season, a rash of thefts occurred on their fishing nets. To stop this, the Ojibways decided to stay overnight near their nets in order to catch the thieves. So they did this. Then, as darkness settled upon them, they noticed some canoes approaching their nets. It was the thieves coming to rob the nets again. The Ojibwa fishermen jumped into their canoes and headed out across the water to catch the culprits. But as they approached the thieves, they were quickly noticed. Immediately, the thieves turned their canoes and headed back in the direction from which they came. The Ojibwa fishermen pursued them to a steep rock cliff on the south shores of Lake Nipissing called Cross Point. The fleeing canoes began heading towards the huge cliff. Believing that they had the thieves cornered, the Ojibways pursued them with great confidence. Then suddenly, the cliff opened up, and the mysterious thieves paddled into this opening. And as suddenly as it opened, the cliff closed, leaving the Ojibways aghast. The Ojibwa fishermen had been chasing members of a legendary ghost tribe called Memegwaysuck. A third story, bearing a remarkable resemblance to the previous two tales, was recorded by the celebrated New Zealand-Canadian anthropologist Diamond Gennis and published in a 1935 paper for the Canadian Department of Mines. These tales derive from the Ojibwe of Parry Island, the latter being a large isle in Lake Huron's Georgian Bay, abutting the eponymous Parry Sound. Like Norval Morrisseau, Gennis's informants believed that more than one variety of little person haunted the rocks and streams of the Canadian Shield. One of these was the Memegwesi, which Gennis called a friendly manido, or benevolent preternatural entity. They may play pranks on the Indians, Gennis wrote, but never harm them. A Parry Island Indian on his way to Depot Harbor saw a Memegwesi going down a creek. It had the outline of a man, but only its face was visible, its body being concealed beneath a huge growth of whiskers. Gennis proceeded to relate a story told to him by a 70-year-old Ojibwe man named John Manitowaba. At the north end of Parry Sound, the elder said, in what white men call Split Rock Channel, there was a crag, known to the Indians as Memegwesi's Crag. Some natives once set night lines there, but their trout were always stolen. At last, one of the men sat up all night to watch for the thief. At dawn, he saw a stone boat approaching, manned by two Memegwesi, one a woman, and the other bearded like a monkey. The watcher awakened his companions, and they pursued the stone boat, which turned and made for the crag. Just as the thieves reached it, the woman turned around and called to the Indians, "Now you know who stole your trout. Whenever you want calmer weather, give us some tobacco, for this is our home." The boat and its occupants then entered the crag and disappeared. But the Indians still offered tobacco to these Memegwesi whenever they passed their home. This same folkloric motif, in which bereaved fishermen chase a canoe of little people into the rock of a cliff, also appears in the traditions of the Plains Cree, one iteration having been recorded by American anthropologist Alanson Buck Skinner in a 1916 article for the Journal of American Folklore, which this author reproduced in a previous piece. Curiously, the more general notion that mysterious little people live inside rocks, an almost universal theme in Ojibwe and Cree tradition, is also present in Icelandic tales of the Huldufolk, or hidden people, whom legend says abide within the volcanic basalt that blankets the land of fire and ice. As mentioned, Diamond Gennis's Parry Island informants believed that more than one type of little person dwelled in the Ontario wilderness. In addition to the Memegwesi, The Parry Island Ojibwe believed in the existence of diminutive entities called Bagudzi Anishinaabe, or Little Wild Indians, which share many elements in common with the fairies of Newfoundland folklore, and in a kindred spirit for which the natives did not have a name. The nameless Manitos used red foxes as their hunting dogs, and imprints of their tiny feet can sometimes be found on rocks impressed into the hard surface in the prehistoric past. The Little Wild Indians, Janice wrote, are dwarfs that do no harm, but play innumerable pranks on human beings. Though small, no larger in fact than a little child, they are immensely strong. Sometimes they shake the poles of a wigwam, or throw pebbles on its roof. Or they steal a knife from a man's side and hide it in his lodge, so that later he wonders how it came there. Often, an Indian will eat and still feel unsatisfied. He wonders how he can eat so much and still be hungry, for the dwarfs, unseen, are stealing the food from his dish. Occasionally, you hear the reports of their guns, but cannot see either the dwarfs or their tracks. Yet Pegamagabo once saw their tracks, like those of a tiny baby, on a muddy road on Parry Island. Certain dwarves haunt a crevasse in a rock on French River, where they sometimes make themselves visible. If you throw them some food, they disappear. The Little Wild Indians are the brownies of Parry Island mythology, except that the adults believe in their existence no less than the children. Another Ontario Little People story appears in the writings of Colonel George E. Laidlaw, a Canadian Army cavalry officer and amateur archaeologist who fought in the Northwest Rebellion and the Boer War, not to be confused with his father, an accomplished Scots-Canadian railwayman of the same name. In his 1915 book, Ojibwe Myths and Tales, Laidlaw included an old Ojibwe story about diminutive beings called Nim-Mah-Kie. Once, a long time ago, he wrote, before the white man came to Canada, an Indian struck out through the bush to hunt. It came on a storm, and he took a line for camp, which was by a little lake away up north. It came on worse, and the Indian crawled under a projecting pine tree. He saw the lightning strike several trees, and looking very closely at one tree that was struck, he saw a little man, about 2 feet high, standing by one side of the tree. And looking again at the tree, he saw another little man standing at the other side of the struck tree. Both these men were fine little fellows, all black and shining, and are called Nim-Mah-Kie, or Thunder. They climbed up in the air like they were climbing ladders, and disappeared. After they went up, more lightning came down. These little men set the lightning at the trees and make the thunder. Interestingly, Laidlaw's description of the Nim-Mah-Kie having black complexions evokes the testimony of a stony hunter and medicine man named Hector Crawler, who claimed to have encountered little people while hunting in the Rocky Mountains sometime in the late 1800s. According to Banff-based interpreter Norman Luxton, whose words were recorded by Canadian ethnographer Marius Barbeau in his 1960 book, Indian Days in the Western Prairies, a certain time when he was in the mountains, when alone, Crawler saw what he called little black men, describing them to me as elfish, not fairy forms. He described them to me as elves, wearing little plug hats and cutaway coats. Our last Ontario story is taken from a 2023 article for the North Ontario travel website, written by a student named Josie Cormier. Josie is a member of the Red Rock Indian Band, located on Nipigon Bay at the northern end of Lake Superior. According to Josie's grandmother, Doghead Mountain, located across the bay from the reserve, was traditionally called Memegwesi, or Mountain of the Little People. According to Josie's grandmother, Doghead stunted inhabitants lived in the roots of the mountain, and delighted in playing tricks on those who trespassed on their haunts. When I asked her about what kind of tricks they play, Josie wrote, she said they like to do things like tip your water over if you leave it out on the ground open and unattended. Then she told me about someone she knew who had a trap line over there, and whenever they trapped something, the little people would let it go. If you'd like to hear first-hand encounters of little people in Canada, please check out my video, Real Encounters with Little People in Canada, which you can find by clicking the link in the description.